My name is John Cayley. I'm a professor in literary arts, and I'm here to introduce Hannes Bajohr. But first, some thanks. Thanks to the Kogut Institute for the Humanities and Amanda Anderson, and to the Collaborative Humanities Lab, Model Scale Context, Holly Case and Suresh Venkata Subramanian. I'm sorry, and I'd also like to thank my co-instructor in the course Reading the Large Language Models that Hannes was also kind enough to visit. And I also have a few announcements, if I can juggle my device, because Model Scaled Context has a few events coming up, particularly on Monday at 2 p.m. here. Oh, sorry, no, that's today. On Monday, 12 noon, in room 006, Libby O'Neill from Yale will talk on cybernetic emigre, systems theory between Vienna and the United States. And on Thursday, April 3rd, that's a fair way away, but still, at 4 o'clock here, Stephanie Dick will talk on the blaze of lights at Western Avenue, criminality and computation in the first American law enforcement data bank. And finally, on April 4th, the day after, there's going to be a workshop in here, again, on models, humanities at the edge of the human. Okay, so make a note and clear your diaries. Hannes Bajohr is an assistant professor of German at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on the history of German philosophy in the 20th century, political theory, and theories of the digital and AI. His academic texts have appeared in Configurations, Poetics Today, and New German Critique, among others. His most recent book, composed with Simon Roloff and published in German in 2024, will appear in English translation as Digital Literature from Minnesota University Press. He is also active as a distant and not so distant author of digital literature. The novel, Berlin, Miami, in parentheses, co-written with a self-trained large language model, will come out in translation with MIT Press in 2026. The title of his self-translated book, Blanks, which I'm going to show you, is published by Denver's Counterpath Press in 2022. Its title springs from the German title, Halbzug, literally half-stuff, and references the partly prepared but unfinished components of industrial manufacture. It is a book of digital poetry and offers me a concrete example of the way Hannes Bajohr's work is exemplary in providing essential context, and here we are under the auspices of models, scale, context, for the economic, social, political, and especially cultural critical developments which motivate our current interest in, not to say hysteria over, so-called AI as implemented by large models. This afternoon, Hannes's talk will address the question of authorship in what he has allowed us to see as an era of post-artificial textuality. Clearly, authorship is reconfigured when it is provided with assistance of any kind. As and when this assistance is deemed to be autonomous, well then, perhaps there's now a collaborator, an authorial humanities collaborator in the mix. Our understanding of these circumstances deserves, however, to be nuanced and enriched by previous critiques of authorship that are sometimes poorly glossed. Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, which still often conceals its birth of a reader, and Michel Foucault's author function, which seems primed for where we find ourselves now. Hannes knows this, and he also knows that we have been living with the authorial assistance of digital affordances, and particularly the networked database archive, for a considerable time. And that a significant number of humans, human co-authors, himself included, have been reconfiguring their authorship over the same period. Part of what he does is to document and analyze this history in terms of authorship. He reminds us that most of the problems that contemporary AI presents us with are not exactly new, and that this context will help us to better understand and be prepared for whatever, in this moment, takes us over or not certain horizons of the humanities, in the light of which we live and make new work. Please welcome Hannes Bajohr.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction, John. I'm really happy to be here, and we had a great time yesterday in the seminar too. And I'm going to speak about authorship and the kind of changes that we see in authorship, and maybe a way to first describe them before we move on to evaluation. I would like to begin with a short note about myself. So my academic background lies somewhere between literature, philosophy, and media studies. I wrote my dissertation on a topic that's quite far away from the digital generation of text, namely about 20th century German philosopher Hans Blumenberg and his theory of language. At the same time, I have long maintained a parallel interest in digital literature, both as a topic and as a practice. That is the creation of literary text with the aid of computers. To be sure, this form of literary production did not begin with ChatGPT. Rather, it has a history that extends back to the invention of the computer and even further. There is, however, a connection between those topics, for I see digital literature as an applied philosophy of language. The production of digital language necessarily assumes certain principles about how language in general functions, and conversely, engaging with such text allows us to reflect on those very assumptions. One fundamental idea that recurs time and again and that makes this generation possible is the harnessing of linguistic productivity through combinatorial calculus. So the notion that a finite set of symbols can generate an infinite number of text through rule-governed recombination. This idea is very old. Indeed, it predates the computer by centuries and is central to the tradition of rule-based literature that can be considered to belong to the prehistory of digital literature. But it also does not quite lead all the way up to the reality that are large language models. Somewhere in between, I believe, there is a break in the logic of language production, a hiatus introduced into the activity that is writing. This hiatus has profound effects, and one of them is how we think of authorship. In what follows, I will first offer a very brief glimpse into this prehistory of digital writing before turning to the ways in which computers came to be employed for literary production in the 20th century. From there, I will turn to two possible questions. First, I will examine the notion of authorship in digital literature from a production perspective. How does the act of writing change when its process is mediated by computational systems and, moreover, by very distinct computational systems? Second, I will give some consideration to the conditions of the receptions of these works, particularly the implications that arise when machine-generated texts become phenomenological, indistinguishable from those written by humans. Oops, that was the end. Let me start with some examples of rule-based literature, both from the history and the prehistory of digital literature. A well-known and striking early example of the combinatorial approach to language can be found in the Baroque period. Georg Philipp Harsdorfer's fünffache Denkring der deutschen Sprache, the five-fold thought ring of the German language, as you can see it here. Influenced by Leibniz's idea of a mathesis universalis, this device consists of 5 concentric rings, each inscribed with word parts and prefixes. When rotated, the rings generate new German words, up to 97 million possible combinations. And while many of these are not actually occurring words, The device lays out a distinct space of possibility based on limited constraints. In the Denkring, linguistic productivity is pushed down to what we today might call subword units and put into practice for a poetics of inventio that operates at the stage of composition. A writer would maybe not find generation here, but inspiration. So this is also part of a poetic tract. A well-known 20th century example that embraces linguistic productivity as space of possibility can be found in the work of the French group Oulipo, the Louvoir de littérature potentielle, or the Workshop for Potential Literature. Founded in 1960 by writers and mathematicians, including Raymond Queneau and François Le Lyonnais, Oulipo explored the productive capacities of language through formal constraints, sometimes, but not always, treating literature as a combinatorial system. And I'm sure many of you know this, but it's always a nice visual way to show how combination can work in a paper machine. One of Oulipo's most emblematic works, Queneau's 100 milliards de poèmes, 100,000 billion poems, from 1961, consists of 10 sonnets printed on separate pages, with each line on an individually turnable strip. Because all 10 sonnets share the same rhyme scheme and end rhymes, any line can be swapped with its counterparts, enabling 10 to the 14th power, 100,000 billion poems. While Harsdorff's Denkring operated on the subword level, Queneau's system elevates combinatorial productivity to whole lines, exemplifying a poetics of constraint that nevertheless generates an explosion of textual possibilities. Queneau prefaces the book with an epigraph from the computer science pioneer Alan Turing. Quote, "Only a machine can appreciate a sonnet written by another machine." This nod to machine intelligence is no coincidence. Just 9 years earlier, one of Turing's colleagues had produced what is now considered the first piece of computer-generated literature, marking the earliest intersection of digital computation and literary production. In 1952, Christopher Strachey, a British computer scientist, programmed the computer of Manchester University, a Ferranti Mark I, to generate love letters overnight, without human intervention and, at first, without anyone knowing the identity of the producer. The letters were signed MUC, Manchester University Computer, staging the machine itself as the author of the letters. Strachey's approach relied on a slot and fill technique in which predefined sentence templates were populated with randomly selected words from lists of nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. In a 1954 essay, Strachey provided an example of one such template. My adjective, noun, adverb, verb, your adjective, noun. When populated with these randomly chosen words, this structure could yield output such as, my curious enchantment devotedly yearns for your ambition. Here we see another form of linguistic recombination, one that operates at the level of individually word elements. The template remains fixed, but the slot-filling mechanism injects variation, and a very large number of that. One of the first pieces of German computer-generated poetry emerged in 1959, created by Theo Lutz, a student of philosopher and author Max Bense. Lutz's stochastische Texte, or stochastic texts, used a predefined set of nouns, verbs, and logical operators to generate a continuous stream of purely assertive statements, such as, not every castle is old, not every day is old, or not every tower is great, or not every view is free, and so on. Unlike Strachey's love letters, which still left some constants in the otherwise variable template, my and your, Lutz relied solely on the variable elements sourced, by the way, from Kafka's Castle. He did not publish the raw output we can see here. Instead, he carefully selected and edited excerpts, which he then published in Bense's literary journal Augenblick, or Moment. So he acts as an editor, but also the idea of authorship is fully on the side of the program, not of the output, and he made that very clear. So these are two of the most canonical examples of rule-based literary recombination implemented with a computer. And I'm sure many of you know them. They are in every history of computer-generated literature. It is also a principle, this recombination, that is still operative today. In what used to be called Twitter bots, these automated accounts generate text-based content using predetermined rules. with Twitter now being X and charging for API access, many of these have gone either inactive or have migrated to other platforms like Blue Sky or Mastodon. One contemporary example here, and I apologize for all the German text, but I am in a German department, would be artist and poet Gregor Weichbrot in his work Eine Liste, or A List, which uses text culled from current news headlines to isolate instances of numbered words and to assemble them into a list. In this example, for instance, the list begins with 4 super ministries, 2 red cards, 126 mail-in ballots, 9 vehicles, 365 sunny days, 2 former Russia correspondents, and so on. There's a narrativity based on current event that emerges from this mere enumeration of entities that is maybe much more vibrant than Lutz's from cool assertions. And even though Weichbrot uses dynamic text sourcing from the web, the basic principle is identical to that of Lutz, Queneau, and even Harsdorfer. However, while one can certainly trace a direct line from a Baroque poetics manual to contemporary Mastodon and Blue Sky bots, I would hesitate to place current generative AI directly into this continuum. The conceptual and technical foundations of rule-based literature and today's large language models may appear similar in their reliance on recombination, but they ultimately operate on fundamentally different principles. This distinction is particularly crucial when considering questions of authorship. Before turning to this issue, I would like to first provide a brief introduction to contemporary generative AI and its literary application. And again, since kind of the pre-knowledge on these topics is varied depending on the audience, you will know a lot of this. To begin with, the term AI is problematic. It encompasses a wide range of concepts, but is generally used to describe a program that exhibits some degree of problem-solving capability. The history of AI as a field formally begins in 1956 at the so-called Dartmouth Conference, where researchers first articulated the goal of creating machines capable of intelligent behavior. Even at this early stage, 2 distinct approaches emerged. On the one hand, rule-based AI, and on the other, statistical AI. Rule-based models operate much like the programs developed by Strachey and Lutz, though with more sophisticated transformation rules and access to larger knowledge databases. One well-known example of a rule-based AI system is Sherdlu, developed by Tara Winograd in the early 1970s. Sherdlu was an early natural language processing, or an NLP program, that allowed users to interact with a virtual block world using typed natural language commands. An interaction with them would look something like this. So person writes, pick up a big red block. Computer, okay. Person, grasp the pyramid. Computer, I don't understand which pyramid you mean, etc. Right? Here are the blocks, and you can operate them with this kind of grabber thing. What made Sherdlu remarkable was its ability not only to execute commands, but also engage in basic dialogue, asking for clarification when needed and keeping track of past interactions. Yet at its core, this was still a form of symbol manipulation, much like Strachey's love letter program, only with more sophisticated rules and an internal representation of a state that could be modified. While oppressive in its domain, Sherdlu exemplified a key limitation of rule-based AI. Its struggle with disambiguation, its brittleness, and its inability to handle broad contextual knowledge beyond the predefined constraint of its miniature world. This limitation was one of the factors that led to the first AI winter in the 1970s, a period of declining interest and funding in artificial intelligence research. However, from the very beginning of AI research in Dartmouth, there was an alternative to rule-based systems, namely statistical machine learning. Unlike rule-based AI, which expands its capabilities by adding more transformation rules or expanding a structured knowledge database, such as telling Sherdlu more about blocks or teaching it additional nuances of demonstrative pronouns, machine learning allows a system to improve simply by being exposed to large sets of examples. Today, this approach is primarily implemented through deep neural networks, which approximate complex functions by adjusting internal parameters based on vast amounts of data. This shift is particularly significant in the context of natural language processing, or NLP, where the task of processing and generating human language or human-like language is deeply intertwined with broader questions of machine intelligence, such as context disambiguation, a challenge that, as we saw if we had read a little further there, was a major limitation of Shirley. The fundamental difference between rule-based AI and statistical AI is who defines the rules. In traditional AI, it is the programmer who explicitly sets the rules and conditions under which the system operates. In machine learning, by contrast, it is the system itself that over time learns a function that approximates patterns in the input data. This paradigm shift has profound implications for questions of authorship, and I will return to them shortly. Today, NLP and AI-driven language technologies are not confined to literary experiments. They are embedded in nearly every aspect of our writing practices. On the one end of the spectrum, we find kind of low-level NLP assistance in everyday writing tasks. This includes predictive text functions on smartphones, which often rely on non-deep learning methods, such as simple statistic models or rule-based autocomplete systems. More advanced example would be Gmail's Smart Compose, which does use deep learning. Unlike basic predictive text, Smart Compose is trained not only on an individual user's writing style and past emails, but also on a vast data set of global user input. By drawing on the writing patterns of all of Gmail's users, 1.5 billion people, it predicts entire sentences based on the likelihood of their occurrence in an email. These technologies already exert a subtle yet significant influence on our writing, even at a low level. They contribute to the standardization of language, as AI-driven suggestions encourage commonly used phrasing and discourage individual stylistic deviations. And you can see that, especially in German, I don't know how it is in English, it very often suggests a misspelling of a word, even though it is wrong, but it is the one that is mostly used. Over time, this may lead to a type of homogenization of written communication, subtly shaping how we express ourselves. Moreover, the increasing reliance on AI-assisted writing tools might be altering writing competencies and practices in general. In what exact ways remain to be seen. At the other end of the spectrum are large language models, the generative systems we usually have in mind when we talk about AI today. Like predictive text, they extend a given input, but on a vastly larger scale, processing broader context and training on massive corpora, essentially the entire internet. A major breakthrough came in 2020 with GPT-3, which demonstrated AI's ability to produce coherent, human-like text on nearly any topic. The shifted AI-generated language from an academic curiosity to a tool capable of producing output that is practically indistinguishable from human text. The release of ChatGPT in late 2022, and you see a screen grab from that time, so this is already historic, with its ongoing refinements, brought generative AI into widespread use, making it a mainstream writing tool. Again, the implications for everyday writing are profound. Unlike earlier AI-driven aids, LLMs don't just assist. They can generate entire text from scratch with minimal prompting. And as we all know, universities everywhere are grappling with the fact of students using ChatGPT to generate essays. From the outset, the rise of large language models has been accompanied by a narrative of human replacement. An early example of this framing appeared in The Guardian in 2020, which published an article with a provocative title, "A Robot Wrote This Entire Article, Are You Scared Yet, Human?" The headline was both misleading and emblematic of the hype surrounding generative AI. A robot indeed did not write the article in any autonomous sense. Rather, the text was generated in multiple iterations, prompted and edited by human journalists to create a polished final product. One of the most striking suggested future implications of generative AI is what Matthew Kirschenbaum has called the textpocalypse, the looming flood of AI-generated content that could overwhelm human communication. The core issue here is not just the sheer volume of synthetic text, but its indistinguishability from human writing. As the question, was this text written by a human or a machine, becomes harder to answer, a fundamental concept comes under strain, namely that of authorship. This long-held notion that a text is tied to a consciousness, an intentional writer, that is now being tested in ways that earlier combinatorial or generative literature never fully anticipated. right? Reading the love letter or reading the output of Lutz does not make you think this is actually something that a human has written. This is where I believe as textual scholars we can contribute, not only in the domain of literary writing, but also in understanding the broader implications for all textual communication. We should maybe ask ourselves, how does writing change once AI becomes a widely accessible tool embedded in our daily linguistic practices? What are the specific consequences for the concepts that still govern our legal, ethical, and intellectual frameworks? And crucially, what happens when the distinction between human and machine-written text collapses, when we can no longer really tell the difference? Allow me now to turn to a few literary cases before addressing the question of authorship in greater depth. By examining how generative AI has been used in literary contexts, both in niche experiment settings and in more mainstream popular applications, we can maybe better understand the specific way in which AI is reshaping textual production. On the niche experimental end of literary generative AI sits David Jarve Johnston's project Rewrites from 2017, one of the first to use machine learning for text production, or literary text production. It stages writing with AI as a performance, then rather simply a text generation process. Over the course of a year, Jarve trained a large language model each night and then hand-edited its output the following morning in a process he calls carving, which we see here. It's a metaphor that underscores the almost sculptural nature of this engagement with machine-generated text. What makes rewrites particularly interesting is the precise demarcation of agency. The moment when the AI hands over its text to the human editor is explicitly delineated, making the human-machine boundary visible rather than erasing it. This stands in contrast to the more seamless, unmarked collaboration that generative AI often enables. By collecting and publishing the edited text over the course of a year in a series of 12 heavy volumes, each corresponding to a month of the project, Jarve further framed the endeavor as a performance rather than a conventionally literary process. A more mainstream example of generative AI in literary production is the work of Jennifer Lepp, who writes under the pseudonym Leanne Leeds. Lepp is a fantasy mystery author who has streamlined her writing process to complete an entire novel in just 49 days, a pace that would be difficult to sustain without AI assistance. In this process, she is aided by the program Pseudowrite, one of many GPT-based literary writing assistants that continues dialogues, adds descriptions, rewrites entire paragraphs, and even provides feedback on human writing. Unlike Jarve's rewrites, which foregrounds the division between human and machine contributions, Pseudowrite and Lepp function more seamlessly, integrating itself into the writing process as a collaborative tool whose stamp on the final product can no longer be neatly distinguished. And finally, I should mention that I too wrote a novel using AI, Berlin, Miami. John mentioned it. Unlike Lepp, who relies on the off-the-shelf AI writing assistant, I took a different approach. I trained my own large language model. To do this, I first selected 4 contemporary German novels as my training data, and then fine-tuned the open source models GPT-J and GPT-Neo-X on this corpus. This allowed the model to develop a style and a narrative sensibility that aligned with the literary texture I wanted to explore. And to be fair, it does not narrate very well, but that was kind of the point of the experiment. I then wrote Berlin, Miami by using the model in a kind of autocomplete fashion, generating each sentence one by one and shaping the text as I went. Now, there's a number of problems and questions that arise with the use of generative AI in writing, many of which have been widely discussed across ethical, political, economic, and legal domains. There are ethical concerns: who is accountable for AI-generated content? In the case of factual errors, misinformation, or hate speech, responsibility is often unclear, particularly for non-literary text where AI-generated output can have real-world consequences. There are political and economic dimensions. The commodification of language by AI raises concerns about representation and biases. Whose voices, linguistic styles, and cultural perspectives are embedded in these models, and whose are marginalized? There are legal questions. The copyright status of AI-generated works remains unresolved. As it stands, AI-produced text is not copyrightable under most jurisdictions, since copyright law still assumes human authorship. Moreover, training models on existing text raises issues of intellectual property and fair use, particularly when AI-generated content closely mimics human writing. However, while these debates are crucial, I would like to focus on questions that fall more directly within the realm of literary studies, authorship, and reception. For before we can turn to these more complex questions of ethics, the economy, and law, I think we first need to map out the operative chains and actors involved in these processes. Understanding who or what is contributing to text production is essential for analyzing how AI-generated text function within literary and cultural frameworks. What is more, we need to ask which assumptions do we have toward artificial text, and to what degree are they subject to change or not. Accordingly, I believe what should interest us is twofold. On the production side, we are compelled to ask who is involved to what degree, in which social and technological context. Here the task is to identify actors and causal chains and to understand who and what plays which role at which point of the process. On the reception side, the questions are who is recognized as an author by virtue of which ontological assumptions, and how are attitudes towards text changing with AI writing technologies. I also should say, when asking such questions, it is important to make two basic assumptions. First, we do not have strong AI. Autonomous AI production is at best a regulative idea, all talk of agents notwithstanding. ChatGPT and other NLP should therefore not be overestimated and even less anthropomorphized. We are still confronted with weak or narrow AI that relies on the presence of a human counterpart. Thus, cooperation and co-creation, in short, human-machine assemblages, seem to be the better cognitive model than the talk of machine autonomy. It is always about a type of collaboration, though it can take very different forms. Management professor Ethan Mollick discusses these as cyborgs and centaurs. If centaurs represent collaborations that maintain clear boundaries between human and machine, Java and I might be examples here, then in cyborg writing, human and machine are so intertwined that their respective contributions can no longer be separated. This might be the case with Jennifer Lepp. Yet this model is, I think, still too limited to describe what is actually happening in these cases. Let me therefore now turn to the production perspective. Here my idea is to look at technologies and their specific chains of operation involved in the production of text. This way we should start not with a strong authorship function in the vein of Foucault as an ordering of discourse, but more modestly by asking about the causal forces behind it. That's what I call causal authorship. Urheberschaft rather than Autorschaft, mere production rather than the moral right to ownership, then would be about the question of how distant the human is from the resulting text. The greater the distance, the higher the degree of authorship, as it were. This is admittedly simplistic, but I think it makes sense to start simple, not least because here we see a marked difference when comparing the new type of AI to older technologies of writing that I have discussed before. So, primary authorship, going through these kind of strata now. Primary authorship would be the still valid standard of conventional immediate writing in which an author more or less directly puts text on a paper or onto a data carrier. The entities that stand between the writer and the text may be technical in nature, from quill to typewriter to word processor, and may have some effect on the output, as media studies has repeatedly pointed out. But their determinative influence does not diminish the connection between author and text that is perceived as causally unbroken. The act of writing is localized entirely or predominantly on the side of the person operating the apparatus of writing, and all other actors involved are merely passively mediated, or they have maybe measurable, but in the end, non-decisive impacts on the author or the text. That this model is by no means valid for all forms of writing can be seen by turning to the additional degrees of distance that rupture this unbroken connection and insert a gap in its relative immediacy. Secondary authorship would thus be a first-order difference that duplicates the act of writing. Strictly speaking, it appears in all rule-based poetry, be it the combinatorial poetry experiments of Harsdorfer or those of the modern avant-gardes like Oedipus Quinault. It is also the model of authorship at work in the rule-based literature like Strachey's love letters or Lutz's stochastic texts. And I call this sequential writing or the sequential paradigm. You can ignore this for the moment. The author's contribution in these cases is to formulate a sequence of rules, the execution of which produces the work. The act that establishes this rule sequence is, on a causal level, indistinguishable from primary authorship. But the resulting text has a vicarious function, being merely the first module in a chain of operations that outputs the final text. Authorship here means writing a text that writes a text. However, it's not always necessary that the operative text be human-made. It may itself be the product of an earlier production step. The machine learning process of modern AI inserts a second hiatus into the chain of operations and brings forth tertiary authorship. Computer scientist François Chollet has described the essential difference between the rule-based and the machine learning paradigm as follows. A rule-based computation can be described as rules plus data equals answers. Machine learning follows the scheme data plus answers equals rules. It is not deduction, but what Charles Sanders Peirce has called abduction. Thus, rules are no longer written in a program script whose application to data produces an output, as is the case in Strachey-Lutz or Weichbrot, but rather a neural network is trained on a large set of exemplary outputs. It then produces the weight model, unreadable to humans, that makes the rules that eventually lead to the final text. Nevertheless, even in the tertiary model, authorship is still located, as it were, in the engine room of the digital. The choice of the training algorithm, the settings of the model, the curation of the training dataset, they are still subject to the user's control and choice. With the advent of large language models such as ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, this may not always be the case. One can now plausibly speak of quaternary authorship. Since large language models are predominantly proprietary software, which is still in most cases too large to be trained from scratch by individual users, which might change, but I think it's important to keep in mind that most people will use ChatGPT and not Llama and trace some things themselves. Consumers are most often than not limited to the factory settings and cannot choose their own dataset. What is more, the only way to interact with these models is through their graphical interface or their API via natural language prompts. This is ChatGPT. Thus, instead of writing the code that writes the program, or training a language model on a large number of poems and having an output new ones like Java, in the quaternary model, it is solely this linguistic input that counts and that is still under human control. Promptology, the efficient, even virtuosic formulation of such input prompts, is the main mode of operation of quaternary authorship. But because it can only operate within a given system, it also means il n'y a rien hors du modèle. There is no outside model. Authorship is encapsulated in the iron cage of commercial language technology, whose precise workings are unfathomable to the outside user. These degrees of causal authorships are ideal types, intended to bring some structure into what has been a rather unstructured debate about AI authorship. They are therefore not exhaustive, nor are they meant to indicate any kind of teleological or progression from low to high. A much more serious critique would be that this model still presupposes, unequivocally, that a human be at the beginning of the chain at whose end stands the text. This may seem questionable to those with a more post-humanist sensibility. Particularly science and technology studies have shown how to go further and to include non-human actors in the writing collective, arguing for what one might call distributed authorship. Catherine Hales, for example, explicitly assumes multiple authorships on the part of the computer's hardware and suggests that calculating machines themselves can be thought of as a part of cognitive assemblages. This is in a way the second model I want to present. It is, in some ways it checks the first one. Distributed authorship is articulated primarily in the context of actor network theory, which understands agency precisely not as, quote, limited a priori to what intentional, meaningful humans do, as Bruno Latour puts it, but is distributed across an assemblage of actors in parallel complex chains of operations. Instead of thinking of authors solely as human, then, in an ANT-inspired theory of AI authorship, they would become a process. The empirical person would be just one human actor in an actor network called author. And in a way, this means this position is doubled. Right? The author is the person, but it's also the whole process. This actor network must be imagined as sprawling and immense. It would include not only the human traditionally called author, now severely sidelined, it also includes the human authors of the data set on which the model is trained and who often are not compensated for their work. Nor would it stop with the programmers responsible for the algorithms involved, either abstractly as theorems. At the top there you find the formula for empirical risk minimization, the principle in statistical learning theory that goes back to the 1970s, or concretely as the actual code in which those theorems are implemented. Moreover, it includes the companies behind large language models, be they OpenAI or any other future player, with their market integration and their extractive as well as normative impact on writers everywhere. Apart from the economic, there's also the legal framework, which is still in the process of catching up with the realities of modern text AI. Finally, the network would even include all the matter involved in the productive process, the machines that run the codes, as well as the minerals and rare earths they are made of, which are extracted from the soil in the process that emits CO2, a direct factor in climate change. From this vantage point, the Earth itself would lay claim to be a participant in the authorship network. So conceived, distributed authorship as actor network would be potentially infinite. Drawing the line between what still is and what is no longer part of it would be a pragmatic decision based on the questions one wants to ask of the network. In the first model of authorship, if the first model of authorship still hinges on the human person at the beginning of an operative chain, the second shows how it may just be a node among others in the network that is the author. Yet as relevant as distributed authorship is for checking the anthropocentric and maybe falsely teleological tendencies of causal authorship, it is not without its problems either. Oddly enough, it is its very omnivorousness that may blur what is contained in its network. For as media scholar Jasmin Meerhoff points out, maximally distributed authorship may mention economic and political dependencies, but runs the risk of sublating them into a collective whole that can no longer be addressed as an ethically and politically responsible agent. Here it is advisable to avoid the talk of machine agency and instead acknowledge the actual human authors behind the AI output as laborers, but also as bearers of identities, as sufferers of exploitation, but also as the ones that may be held responsible in their roles as, among other things, authors. When we talk about authorship, however, we cannot just talk about production, but must also take the reception perspective into account. No matter how a text came about, whom do we, as readers, perceive as an author? And what discourses are ordered by this question? Be that ownership, the status of individuals, and many more. The point I want to make in the final part of this talk is this. Reception is fundamentally about recognition. It describes a social fact. This means asking, what are the extra textual conditions for accepting someone or something as an author? As I see it, there have been, on the whole, only two models for the reception of computer authorship, namely deception and co-sociality. The first tendency is about simulating agency, intentionality, and ultimately authorship, not so much by producing them on the object side by technical means, that is, by what John Searle would call strong AI, and what computational creativity tries to do in its more ambitious moments, but by faking it on the reception side. This is famously the basis of Alan Turing's imitation game, a version of which we now know as the Turing test. And I'm sure you all know this. If a human actor cannot distinguish the teletype output of a computer from a teletype text produced by a human, the computer would be functionally considered intelligence, since, in good behaviorist fashion, mind is not measurable other than in its effects. Indeed, due to its textual nature, and it is important for Turing that this is text, partly because you can't build something that looks like a human in the 1950s. Due to its textual nature, the Turing test is essentially an authorship test. As soon as it's no longer obvious which writing comes from the machine and which from the human, the computer must count as an author. But as media scholar Simone Natale points out, Turing's test is fundamentally based on deception. What then does the test, based on a knowledge-power asymmetry between the human person and the design of the AI instance, mean for reception expectations of generated text? In a word, nothing. It would have to be the same as for humans because it expects humans, and then it only applies to humans. Such deception does not allow any leeway for the recognition of computers to change. Instead, it accords to them, falsely and deceptively, the status of humans. If they were unmasked as AI, this status would have to be promptly taken away from them, and with them, the status of authors. The conditions for authorship then remain untouched, and an actual computer authorship is not achieved. An alternative to the deception model is what I call co-sociality. Here, not the Turing, but the Durkheim test, as it was suggested by Susan Leigh Starr, would be the paradigm. The Durkheim test focuses the evaluation of an AI system on its ability to fulfill social goals within a community. In contrast to the isolated psychological simulations of the Turing test, the Durkheim test highlights to what degree an AI system can support collaborations distributed across different actors by incorporating diverse perspectives. Instead of aiming at deception, it would serve as a measure for recognizing an AI system as an actual social agent from the perspective of those interacting with it. Understood this way, the Durkheim test inquires into the system's co-sociality, although Starr does not specify how the test would actually be performed. It's really not a type of operation, but it's more of a thought experiment. The idea of co-sociality ranges from weak to strong models. In the weak model, we are confronted with a willful self-deception in which humans project intentionality onto a system of which they nevertheless know to be a machine. If pressed, they would say, I know it's programmed to act this way, or I act as if the computer was a social agent. But in practice, they engage with the system as though it were a genuine conversation partner. This phenomenon, now well known as the ELIZA effect, is named after Joseph Weizenbaum's 1966 chatbot, which was designed to mimic the responses of a Rogerian psychoanalyst. ELIZA's primary mechanism was simple, rule-based transformation, in which it mirrored the user's statements back in the form of questions. I feel unhappy then becomes, why do you feel unhappy? And so you can have a conversation. Yet the chatbot's users behaved as if the program really were a conscious agent interested in their well-being and projected personhood onto it, while at the same time knowing full well that this was not the case. So this was the weak model. The strong model, the weak model where humans merely project intentionality onto machines, there's a strong notion of co-sociality in which AI systems and other non-human entities are truly recognized as social agents. In this view, we can attribute to them agency, intentionality, intention, and even authorship, whether partially or entirely, not because we are deceiving ourselves, but because we actively choose to accord these capacities to them. Crucially, this is not a technical issue, but a social one. The acceptance of machines as legitimate and not only projected communication partners does not depend solely on their actual technical functioning, whether they think or understand in a human-like way, but rather on the prevailing ontologies of agency which within a given society are active. In other words, whether an AI is considered an author, a conversational partner, or even a moral agent is a matter of social recognition, not an intrinsic property of the machine itself. But there is finally a third model. I call it post-artificiality. Instead of being deceived into thinking something is a human author, instead of according authorship to a computer either by willing self-deception or by actual acceptance, the post-artificial stance asks, would these other models still make any sense if one imagined a state in which the use of artificial writing has become so ordinary that the question whether a human or a machine has written the text is no longer relevant? The idea would be that we might go from a state in which all texts are considered to have human authorship, and with ChatGPT, I think this is probably already slightly in the past, to a state in which we would always be unsure whether the authorship is artificial or human. This is, I think, something already the case in with the increase of automated disinformation. Kirschenbaum's Textpocalypse names exactly this scenario, quote, a tsunami of text swept into a self-perpetuating cataract of content that makes it functionally impossible to reliably communicate in any digital setting. What this means, however, is that this situation cannot reliably be mitigated by legal or by technical aids. Technically, it appears doubtful that a detector for AI written text will ever work. The error rate of all current such detectors is almost random. And even if they worked, a few little tweaks to a text would render it undetectable. Legally, any prohibition on generated text without some kind of attribution to an AI, which is kind of part of the EU AI Act, is only a band-aid. After all, the law only sanctions, but does not abolish the crime. Once it is possible to question whether a text might have been generated by a machine rather than written by a human, no certificate or no law can extinguish that doubt. If that doubt can neither be resolved nor, as I believe, be borne permanently, the only solution is to undo its premises. It is not unlikely then that expectations that we have toward an unknown text itself will become post-artificial. Instead of suspecting a human behind a text or being haunted by the skepticism as to whether it was not a machine after all, we simply lose interest in that question. We might then focus only on what the text says, not on who wrote it. Post-artificial text would be agnostic as to their origin. In this post-artificial perspective, literary studies return to their own terrain. After all, students of literature have long been trained to analyze text without an eye to its maker. In a sense, AI is merely accelerating the development of a broader social reading practice, one that has until now primarily existed within professional literary scholarship. Of course, the idea of post-artificial writing is wildly speculative. It's an extrapolation of current trends, imagining a future where artificial writing is fully integrated into daily communication. Ironically, in doing so, this form of speculation functions much like machine learning itself, predicting outcomes based on patterns observed in the present. Yet, even as a heuristic, this thought experiment, I believe, is useful. It allows us to reflect on the ontology of artificial text, not as exceptional cases, but as part of a possible future in which authorship, as we understand it today, is redefined. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My question with post-artificiality, which I think is a very provocative concept, is, when you talk about the transformation of our conception of authorship, what does it do to our conception of readership? And is there a corresponding transformation in the questions asked of why read, and what is the relationship of reading to the social? What is the relationship of reading to, the constellation of, or the, as you point to, the philosophy of language? So how would a rethinking of the notion of authorship entail a rethinking of the notion of readership, or being a reader?
I believe the kind of split in the presentation goes to that point, right? The post-artificiality only makes sense from a perspective of readership, only makes sense from a perspective of reception. So I think that exactly this, the doubt, the skepticism, and maybe the moving on to some other agnostic model is the change in readership. It does not say anything about the social function of reading. I agree with that. And I think this is, at least to this question, almost a secondary concern. I think that there might be a much more stable notion of reading than there is of authorship, at least in the. I do believe so. I mean the.
So you think people will happily read texts that they don't care or know about the author in the same way that they did hitherto?
I think that the readership expectation that is restructured by this model, of course, has an effect on this. I mean, I talk about the difference between marked and unmarked texts, in which the question to what degree communication happens between a text and myself is on the one hand less of an issue for if you read a street sign, you don't ask about who wrote it, right? You ask about what does it tell you, what type of orientation does it give you. There are specific texts that defy that pure information communication, which are obviously literary texts. But only a subset of these texts, I think, is immediately motivated by a knowledge of the origin of the author. You have that case with autobiography. You have that case to a large degree when it comes to autofiction. Obviously, this cannot be a purely agnostic relationship to who wrote it. But that might also be a way in which readership reevaluates these kinds of texts, right? The modernist stance in which the author disappears completely behind the text. The text is hermetic, the text needs to be deciphered. The text is something that readers have to kind of wrangle with as an object in itself, might maybe become less interesting. And you could say, especially in what we see at the moment, a kind of struggle between this classic understanding of what authors do and the rise of AI. This might be a way to stress the human origin, right? If I say this book is genuinely and guaranteed human written, this is something that purely pointing to the text itself is no longer possible. You can always doubt that there is something behind it that generates the text. If you connect it to the identity of the author by saying this is autofiction, this is based on some kind of autobiographical background, this might be a little less, it might be mitigated. Obviously, you can't abolish it. As soon as the doubt is in the world, it cannot go away. But I think this would be maybe one way in which these, what you talk about, the motivation, the interest in the written text be affected by this change. Does it?
I still don't know how it accounts for something like context, the desire for context on the part of the reader for thinking about what is the context in which this emerged, even if not, the author concretely.
Yeah.
Like, and in order as a sense-making mechanism, like, because it disallows the possibility to think context in a concrete way. And, that tacit desire of the reader to understand the context in which something is produced, then what happens to that tacit expectation?
It might become less tacit. I mean, that's exactly the point I was trying to make, talking about something like autofiction. The context needs to be, at least when it comes to the question of origin, on the one hand, either ramped up or ignored. And I think in the long run, this is the purely speculative part of this, and I agree this is very unilinear, is that because it's so difficult to maintain this, maybe some kind of post-artificial stance would be the smoother way of dealing with this. I have to say, though, that the role of literature is obviously a special one. Literary texts are very marked, very special texts. What I have in mind is something that you see at the moment already, namely that certain types of very functional text are automated. Blog posts, product descriptions, copy text, and so on. At the moment, we might find this strange, or we think this is a type of slop, right? This is text that is pure filler. But I don't know if it has to stay that way. And it's especially these type of unmarked texts that might be prone to be read in a post-artificial way, right? In which you do not really care. You do not care, but you still treat them as a type of information, or even, I don't know, a type of pleasure. And once you know that authors can use this too, that this is something that you, in a way, have to contend with, and one way to contend with it is to kind of diminish the importance of it. Right? If the next book by your favorite author, the next novel, could be generated to some degree with the assistance of something like pseudo-write, does that change the way you receive it? Yes and no. And I think this kind of reduction of friction in the reception of these texts is maybe the premise of this idea of post-artificiality.
Thank you for the talk. This is another version of Holly's question. So first of all, I'm very struck by your emphasis on indifference, as the kind of affective correlate to post-artificiality. And you've focused on functional text, and I was thinking informational on the one hand versus literary, but I was thinking, how does this play out in relation to information, aesthetics, and politics? And I think this kind of heightens the whole question, well, for me anyway, heightens the whole question about the importance of context. And even if you're not necessarily concerned about whether a single human author stands behind a text, you might be concerned about the fact that a political group or a country with specific political interests is behind bot-generated language. And so I feel like this emphasis on indifference is troubling to me because it's precisely the affect that authoritarian governments attempt to produce in their subjects, like a kind of this kind of making them, docile and unconcerned. And I realize there's a bit of a leap there, but I do think that there's what happens to the profound feelings of commitment and belief and concern that people bring to texts, especially political, but also literary. And, anyway, that's all.
I think the question is, or rather the way to answer this, I don't have an answer for this, but it is a type of negotiation that we have to go through. And I would say political misinformation, deepfakes, etc., is something that is very often given as an example. But even now, most of it, what we call bot-generated text, is actually human-generated. Right? When you can read studies that talk about the prevalence of actually automated text, it is very small, and we already have a wave of misinformation in which real people maybe copy-paste certain messages on social media, but it's still real people. Right? The so-called bot farms are humans, and maybe in a way that you could call a kind of reverse Turing test, in which the idea that a political actor has that much power computationally is already part of the message of disinformation. So I'm not sure if this is really the main thing that we have to deal with, because obviously disinformation is a huge problem, but it's not solely a problem of automated text generation. It is a problem of the distribution of text that are malignant and want to influence. So again, I don't have a good answer to this, but I would like to shift the emphasis a little bit there.
One question that perhaps sums up all that I've been thinking: will we be able, and by we I mean sort of collective, distributed, able to produce, write any language that is not processed? So in other words, I see an analogy, and maybe this is a little provocative, a little trivial, between processed language and processed literature distributed in your model and processed food. I mean, so my question, one of my questions is, do you envision a situation in which these models are coexisting and we still have a choice? Or in your prediction, a situation in which we won't have a choice and we be entirely alienated? Right now, my thinking is from simulation to alienation.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think this might be the optimism in this model, that the way to deal with a future that might consist of purely processed, purely alienated text is one that would be so unbearable that we have to change our way of engaging with it. And that's what I mean by the post-artificial stance. Again, I think that literature is a specific category. It has so many rules that are different from functional or other types of texts, that there might be a kind of a certain pocket of resistance in that. And I think we can see this already now. There's a lot of talk of kind of the resistance of writers to AI produced text. And this might be one of the reasons for it. What I'm starting with as an assumption is that in the long run, there is no good way. You can give all kinds of contextual clues, but you can never be certain that something is not AI generated. How do we deal with that? This is one answer. Obviously, it is a speculative one, but it's one that seems on a certain level maybe the most likely, at least for kind of the lower ranks of textual production. Literature itself, I don't know. However, there is maybe an answer to be given in exactly the type of text that Java produces, right? It is one in which the difference between those is heightened, right? Instead of writing novels in which I hide the way in which it is written, is it a typewriter? Do I write by hand? Do I write in a word processor? It is one that communicates the tool by which it was made very kind of offensively. And I think that's not offensively. What do you say in English? Directly. It carries it on its sleeve. And maybe this is a way to get around this, right? This would be the opposite of what someone has called organic literature, one that is guaranteed human-made, which you can't prove. But maybe you can show the difference of, or at least the medium by which it was produced. Again, this would be obviously very nice for us because it kind of makes digital electronic literature something special.
I just wanted to ask a question about maybe towards the question of like docility. Just ask you about some places where it still seems that human authorship within AI-generated text really kind of comes back with a vengeance. I'm thinking of, you know, when you ask an AI model something and it says, I can't respond to that, that's because some human workers have re-ranked the results or done some process that allows for the reinforcement learning with human feedback. Then some people, I don't know if people still do this, but will try to essentially jailbreak that to try to make a model that's been trained to not be racist say something racist, for instance. And then you know that it's had this human, you know what the human has done there because the model has been you know, trained to not be racist. And then when it's racist, you can say, well, a human did that. They cleverly, you know, got around whatever system OpenAI put in place to make it not say that. And then maybe just a third one, writing for models. So people have started to anticipate that their text is going to be absorbed by models. And then maybe later, a few years from now, you can look and say, oh, I wrote a blog post on exactly this, and it's the only thing out there on this topic. And now I can see it in GPT-7.
There was the glue in the pasta sauce, right? This was a famous example that someone had written a Reddit post many years ago and said that it's wood glue is a great ingredient when you make a pasta sauce. And now Gemini or the Google AI assistant tells you that when you, I mean, at least there was one
So I guess just my question is like in your model that you showed us on that last slide, these kind of forms of like human authorial aggressivity that kind of only make sense in terms of creating an AI model. Where do they fit into your model? Are they just kind of, are we going to move away from them? Are they peripheral, or is there something important about those moments of tension?
I mean, the thing I would say is you can only jailbreak the beginning of the chain, right? Reception is nothing that can be jailbroken indirectly this way. You would be reliant on people who are doing this on a large enough scale. And at least in the framework of Kirschenbaum with the textpocalypse, there's simply the mass of text we are confronting that would, in which something like this would be a drop in the bucket. And I think this is the situation that I start. You can always resist in certain ways, but what is the kind of the general tendency here? And maybe this should be highlighted more. These types of resistance. I think that what Java does belongs in that, because there is this mark of the handing over from the machine or to the machine. But again, this a human did this requires someone to do it at the beginning, and this you could also speculate is maybe something that becomes more difficult the better these models get, and the more they become these iron cages that keep their insides out, right? Obviously, jailbreaking is a type of red teaming. It's a way of testing the limits, which then have to be fixed. And this might be an arms race, or it might be something that in a few years is no longer possible, really. And again, the writing for models too. We don't know how this will pan out, but my thinking is that this too is a type of drop in the ocean that does not, in the end, really make that much of a difference. This would be the more pessimistic view here.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for taking the time. I'm actually a student in a class called History of AI right now, so this was super cool. In a lot of our readings, we've sort of studied how humans are kind of obsessed over what we can make AI do or artificial intelligence do, and I loved how you brought up some of the implications of that in commoditization of language, marginalization of voices, things like that. But one question we've also sort of discussed, and I'd love to just get your opinion on it, is are there certain things that you think AI ought not to do? Rather than just discussing what it can do, is there something that should just be off limits, according to you?
Lots of things, right? Obviously, we don't want AI producing mass disinformation and so on. My point is, these normative questions have to reckon with a certain tendency that comes into effect once this reader expectation shifts, in which we don't know anymore, and in which nothing, neither law nor technology, can really mitigate this doubt. And I start with the assumption of this doubt not being something we can get out of the world. And yes, you can rule out all kinds of things, but and then it might be a quantitative difference, how much disinformation, rather none or only. But this is kind of the kind of theory design of this. We start from this doubt because that doesn't go away.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So this might be a bit of a niche question, but it's about literary history because you offered. You said literature is a kind of niche or a limit case, but you also the history you offered was kind of literary history. And you could offer another one, where you talked about, let's say, the surrealist exquisite corpse, which is, a version of some of the experiments that you would, which is kind of like telephone, right, where somebody writes one word and then somebody writes another word, and you end up with a poem like Exquisite Corpse, or the Nouveau Roman, or you talked about Barton Foucault, and they're clearly coming out of the Nouveau Roman. They're responding to that. And when I teach, the Surrealists or Oulipo or the Nouveau Roman, like at least I'm not really teaching them because I'm so interested in the poems that were produced in the technique of exquisite corpse. I'm interested in what they were reacting to and what they were reacting and what they made possible. And I'm wondering what will happen now, because it seems, I had an idiotic experience last night on Spotify where I realized that for the last few nights I've been listening to AI-generated jazz trios, which I thought had been real people. And I'd got there, and I looked them up and I was like, oh, that's pretty nice. And I looked them up and I was like, there's no record of these. And so I'm listening to Muzak without knowing it. And I think of the opening of the Crying Lot 49, which is about Oedipa Maas is listening to Muzak, and she's like, oh, I like the bit when Boy Beaver soloist comes in. And of course you can't do that with Muzak, right? There is no history of Muzak. It's all the same. So I think a question is emerging, but what is literary history going to look? I mean, it seems like it's hard to know in this kind of, like, what, if literature is a kind of Muzak, then it seems like we've abolished the possibility of literary history, which, part of your argument was, at least wasn't based on, but it was drawing some of its power from.
Yeah. I would say some literature is already Muzak, and actually a very big part, right? Yeah. A lot of literature that in itself, is primarily consumable, is produced in a kind of in a mass-produced way, written by committee, etc. A Tom Clancy novel does not have one author, right? It's many people who do that. The difference is that until now, we were sure that this committee is made up of humans. They might use some kind of card catalog of possible plot points, but that's not really the point. The point is that we still have subjects that in some way or other are responsible for the text that is produced. And I think this is changing, right? And so the example of the surrealists, you could say, well, it's not really the subject, it's the unconscious of the subject that is writing, but it's still a human unconscious. This is changing too, right? And there's a lot of talk of computational unconscious. Sarah Baldwin wrote about this a while ago. Or that ChatGPT, because it has the knowledge of all the internet, is kind of the computational unconscious of our culture and so on. Maybe, but it is still something different, not knowing who is the originator of this. And we can talk about, yes, of course, the training data is human and so on, but I think there is a cut, and this is why this this model of distances is important to me. And what you say, this was Muzak, this was AI produced. I would ask you to hold on to this reaction and see how you feel in a couple of years. I finished, this is based on 2 articles I wrote. I finished one of them saying, dear reader, maybe I used AI here or not. What's your reaction? Do you feel deceived or not? And I think the reaction to this now is different than 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I know a lot of people who use AI in their writing, and I don't think we care anymore because it is used in a certain way. It just summarizes things, it expands things on. And this doesn't seem to be the main point anymore. And this is what I mean by this kind of agnosticism. Maybe music is still different than text, but I didn't know I was deceived. At which point does that change? I think that's kind of the phenomenological question that I want to ask.
Yeah, adding on to that, I kind of had 2 questions. One is about authorship and then who gets to decide what it is. My first question is like, what distinguishes a real author from a not real author? And then what makes the text human? And also my second question is who gets to decide what authorship means and what does this say about power structures in our definition of literature?
Mm-hmm. Could you say more about real and non-real author? What do you mean with that?
Like what exactly constitutes an author and what do you say makes someone an author and someone not an author?
Mm-hmm. Well, we could go back to Foucault and the idea that authorship structures discourses. I've used kind of not being super transparent about it, 2 notions of authorship here. One is this idea of the causal production of text, right? Who is at the beginning of writing it? And then every written piece in a way has an author, except if it's completely automated, then you have these distance models. Or you could say an author is someone whose name organizes a discourse in such a way that it makes, for instance, that's the example that I always find very useful in Foucault. If you have a corpus of texts written by Kafka or someone else, and one of those is different, radically different than the other ones. If this was a computer who wrote this, this would be an error. If it's an author with a capital A, this is something that needs to be explained. You can't discard it, you need to explain why that is. And this is because it kind of is a work, is an oeuvre that is kind of coagulated around this notion of authorship. And then you can ask at which point does that happen? And that is a process of cultural negotiation that is very much part of certain power structures and certain kind of the influence of a specific group and so on. Used to be a certain type of literary criticism. It might be something that you can now look up at what's at the top of an Amazon bestseller chart and so on. What makes a text human? I don't know. I think that's a question I can't answer because that is a normative question, and I'm not sure if I want to answer this. Right? As someone who does hold certain experimental literature in high regard, I would like to get away from a certain normative standard assumption of what literature is, right? This is a good text, this is a bad text. Why? Because it deviates from a certain norm. Is that a good answer? I don't know, because breaking norms and inventing things that are not coherent, that do not rhyme, that are different from a certain standard, I think is a very valuable, and now I'm using obviously normative language, but it's something that is as legitimate as other types of writing. So saying something is less human than other, I don't know if I want to use that. This goes all the way up to completely computer-generated text, because as I said in the beginning, there is no complete autonomy. Someone has to decide to publish this text. Whether they decide to publish this text as part of a work, like Java did or like I did, or kind of put it into the world in another function, determines how this text is received and what kind of status it has. But there too, I think this is something I'd rather not touch.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Hannes, for that really clarifying presentation. This is in some ways going to Stuart's question, but from a different angle. Many of us who were in literary studies were taught to read literature in precisely the way you described at the end of your talk, as not paying no attention to the author, so to speak, or those of us as old as I am remember new criticism when it was also not the context, not the, it was the poem itself, the linguistic universe of the work. But there's another example, it seems to me, in the history of literary study that might be very instructive for us right now, which is the origins of modern philology in the late 18th century, when Wolff published his studies of Homer and argued on the basis of much erudition that it was impossible to distinguish between the genuine, the authentic poems that we call the Odyssey and the Iliad, and the interventions of the countless interpolators and editors over many centuries. And so that to speak of an author of those two poems as someone named Homer, which apparently just means something like the same, like homo, was a profound error and misunderstanding of what we venerated as our sort of original texts in the West, that they had nothing about them that one could attribute to an author. And this was a scandal in the 19th century. It was a thesis that was much repressed, but I think, respected to a certain extent. And I wonder to what extent that the Homer, scandal of Wolff's essays might not be, sort of an instructive case for us. Maybe it might seem very counterintuitive, but for what we're presented with now, where it's impossible to distinguish between the authentic and the inauthentic, becomes being impossible to distinguish between some kind of human signature and what the machine produces. So I just want to put that to you as a case to consider.
Yes, thank you. I would have to think about this, but my intuition is that the actor network temporalized is maybe a way to model this, right? You have a type of transmission. That transmission, so that the actor network looks static, but obviously it is temporal. It goes in many directions and so on. And maybe this is simply expanding the time frame for this, in which you have a lot of mediated steps that obviously have an influence on the message, on the text itself. But I would have to think about this, and also the kind of equation between authenticity and human production is at work there, and maybe that is also something that we need to keep in mind, that we do make this equation.
Also, in this case, the reaction to this possibility, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Goethe hated this idea.
Yeah.
He says this is unacceptable.
Makes sense, yes.
Yeah.
I'm an STS scholar, and I wanted to ask you about your novel, so Berlin, Miami. Yes. And so I was wondering what, if it's an experiment, what is an experiment in? And I can see easily how it would be on the production side and the questions of chain of operation and where intervention is needed. But I'm actually curious to hear from you more about what the experiment showed you on the reception side, particularly given that your work is translated and that you're the translator. And so what this extra layer shows you about reception, particularly in the legal but also aesthetic context.
Right. Oh, the legal context. Interesting.
Can we have this gentleman's
Yes.
question first, and then we can decide if you're going to do it?
Yeah, my question is kind of like thinking about, like, as there's more and more text that is AI produced, like does this create, is there like a real concern for this like homogenization of language, especially since AI, as you like are saying, is not fully autonomous? Does this potentially reduce the ability for new forms of like creative literature in this age where, like, you're suggesting we can't really be certain or really assume anything is or is not fully human, fully not?
I mean, I can see two ways to answer this. That obviously we're always in types of circular processes of, as it were, input and output when it comes to linguistic production, right? We are formed, we are shaped by the language that is around us. But now someone who also is shaped and shapes this language are these models. So you could think of this as a kind of ecosystem of a change going in each direction. The question for me would be, at which point does the determinant factor become the model rather than the human, right? The texts that were produced by humans. And is this something we might have to worry about? Maybe. I don't know if I have a very good answer for this, but there are ways to think of this. One of the is the idea of was it the autophagy of language models, that if you run out of text to train a model with, you train it with synthetic text and then it deteriorates because it doesn't have the kind of right distribution. This only happens apparently under very specific circumstances. But for the Berlin-Miami novel, this is part of the experiment. At the very last chapter is trained on all the previous chapters. And there you can really see how it goes downhill. The coherence completely goes out of the window, even on a grammatical level, which is quite fascinating to see.
Is that indicated in the text?
It's indicated in the afterword, because this is a type of novel that needs an explanation. The homogenization is also something that I think clearly happens, and it probably happens both on kind of a lexical and a semantic level, but also on one in which certain values are expressed. There's this famous paper by Bender et al. About the stochastic parents has the term of value lock. There's the possibility of a type of value lock, and I think you can also interpret this aesthetically, right? If you have text or a model that is trained on text, there will be a certain predominance of specific text, namely the ones that are just more in number, unless you mitigate for that. So the question is, how does novelty figure in the next generation of this model? If we all, something like certain new pronouns, will they ever make their way into that model because they are such a small slither of the training data? Honestly, I'm not sure. Ellie, maybe you would be able to answer this, whether this is something that would necessarily be a problem, or if it would be easy to mitigate by weighing newer texts more or something like this. But this is kind of the idea of the structural conservatism of language models. And finally, to the novel question, the experiment is, there are several. One is, to what degree can I make text or something that I find to what degree can I use this in a praxis that is usually based on very strict rules? I used to make in this poetry volume poems where you can really see and I tell you what rules are used. So there's kind of a one-to-one mapping from rule to output. This is no longer possible here because the distance is bigger, right? So one question I wanted to investigate in this novel was a hypothesis by the literary scholar called Angus Fletcher at the University of Chicago. He says, AI models can, by definition, are unable to narrate because narration is a causal chain, is a causal structure, and statistical models are correlative. They cannot reproduce causation. And I wanted to put this to the test. And one of the interesting things is, yes, this novel doesn't really tell a story. It is very circular, incoherent, and so on. And yet it does tell a story for me when I read it. And the more I read it, the more coherent does it become. And in the end, this experiment that starts on kind of the production side ends on the reception side. And I find this extremely fascinating. We talked about it in class yesterday, that I am also, as an author, a reader of the text, not only in the act of writing, right? I see what happens, and I'm the first reader of the text that is produced, but I'm also the second reader because when I read this thing once it's done in one go, and then another time, my conception of the text changes. And I think if I had to say whether there's kind of a positive or negative outcome of that experiment, I would say it does tell a story. There is narration. It might not be, obviously then you can say, well, maybe narration is not necessarily or even predominantly tied to some kind of causal chain, which obviously is already a very simplistic claim. But you still can make sense of it. And again, the birth of the reader is kind of reconfigured there in this experiment.
Well, thank you all for great questions.